You're about to listen to a snippet of the Terra Incognita podcast. For the full episode, please click on the Patreon link below. Okay, thank you very much. This is my fourth episode on the discovery of Australia. In the last episode, we spoke about the Spanish quest for Terra Australis. The Spanish were the first to sail in the Pacific Ocean. Between 1567 and 1607, Spain searched for Terra Australis 3 times. These expeditions were funded by the Spanish crown, who hoped they would discover new colonies, converts, and sources of income. Quiros, the leader of the third voyage, was convinced that he had discovered a continent of immense wealth in the south that would rival Columbus's discovery in the west. But his expedition had not brought any profit to the crown, nor had it led to the discovery of a new continent. Nevertheless, the words of Quiros were translated into Dutch, English, and other European languages, and many Europeans came to believe that he had actually discovered the mythical southern continent that the ancients used to speak about. In this episode, we are going to speak about the Dutch. Australia was first discovered by the Dutch. This is not a theory, it is an established fact. When Australia first began to accurately appear on world maps, it was called New Holland. The men who first explored this country had named it after their country of origin. But before we speak about the Dutch, we need to say a few more things about the Spanish. Indeed, our story begins with a conflict between the Spanish and the Dutch. In order to understand this conflict, we must go back to the 16th century. In the 16th century, Spain was the dominant power in the world. She was in control of Portugal, the Philippines, and both North and South America. Gold and silver from the west, and spice and silk from the east, poured into the Iberian Peninsula. In addition to the New World and Portugal, the King of Spain was in control of the Netherlands. Today, we consider the Netherlands one nation. It is synonymous with Holland. But in the early 1500s, the Netherlands referred to 17 culturally distinct provinces, such as Belgium, Flanders, and Holland. Netherlands means low-lying lands, or low countries. These provinces were called the Netherlands because much of their land was flat and situated at or below sea level. Today, the Netherlands refers only to Holland, but back then, people used the term the Netherlands to refer to parts of what is now Belgium and even small portions of northern France. When I say the Netherlands in this podcast, what I really mean is the Low Countries. I'm referring not only to the territory that is modern-day Holland, but also Belgium and even parts of northern France. Spain had first come into possession of the Netherlands in 1506. Under Spanish rule, the Netherlands had flourished. They were one of the richest countries in Europe. They had a thriving textile industry that supplied Europe with the best linen and woolen fabrics. They also grew rich selling salted fish to the rest of the continent. But the main source of Dutch wealth did not come from their booming textile industry or their fisheries. Their main source of wealth came from their trade. As early as the 15th century, the Dutch had built one of the largest shipping industries in Europe, carrying bulk goods such as timber, tar, and salt from the Baltic to the North Sea and the Atlantic coast. The Hollanders were noted for their efficiency, low prices, and the sheer volume of their shipping, which dwarfed their rivals. The men of Amsterdam were at the forefront of European trade, and you could find them at all major trading centres of Europe. Lisbon was the busiest trading centre in all of Europe in the 16th century. Goods from both east and west ended up there. In that busy city, you could find Dutch traders selling wheat, fish, and other products of Northern Europe. They would use the money they earned to buy spice and other merchandise from both the east and the west. They would then sell this merchandise throughout Europe for large profits. This made them extremely rich. In addition to enjoying extreme riches, the Dutch also enjoyed liberty and local self-government. In exchange for heavy annual payments, the Spaniards more or less left the Dutch alone. This began to change after the Dutch converted to Protestantism. Spain decided that it had to quell the Protestant Reformation in its northern territories by any means necessary. Protestants were considered heretics and therefore tortured and massacred. In addition to attacking Dutch religious practices, the King of Spain began attacking Dutch trading practices. In 1594, the King of Spain closed the port of Lisbon to Dutch traders and prohibited Dutch and English ships from trading with any part of the Spanish Empire. He also confiscated every Dutch ship that was docked in either Spain or Portugal. This overbearing behaviour led to the Dutch Revolt, an 80-year war between Spain and the Netherlands. This is obviously a huge topic that's way beyond the scope of this podcast, so we won't, get too far from the topic at hand. I'm just going to read you a short summary of the Dutch Revolt. I am reading a page from James Walker's book, Abel Tasman, His Life and Voyages. I think this book provides some good information on the Dutch Revolt. I'm going to read a page from that book right now. The Dutch Revolt forms one of the most striking epochs in history. It was the first blow struck in modern times for human freedom and liberty of conscience against the despotism of kings and the intolerance of priests. The power of the strongest empire in the world was put forth to crush the revolted citizens. Treachery, torture, and massacre were freely and ruthlessly employed. The struggle would have been hopeless, but that their extremity taught the Dutch to find their strength upon the sea. Powerless before their enemies on land, the patriots took to the ocean. In small vessels, their hardy sailors cut off the Spanish supplies, made daring descents on sea-coast towns, and in process of time set themselves to work to strike Spain in her most vulnerable part, her commerce with the New World, from which she drew her wealth. The beggars of the sea, as the Dutch rovers styled themselves, became the terror of Spain. Not only did they cut off the supplies of gold and silver from the New World on which the Spanish king depended, but in the spoils which they wrested from the enemy and in the trade which they were continually extending, they found the means for their country to carry on the conflict. The King of Spain was unsuccessful in his efforts to destroy Dutch commerce. In vain did he prohibit the Hollanders from trading with his dominions. In vain did he from time to time lay embargoes on their ships and send thousands of their sailors to languish in the dungeons of the Inquisition. The bold Hollanders only replied by vigorous reprisals. They mocked at his prohibitions and continued to carry on an ever-increasing and enormously profitable illicit trade. Dutch privateers triumphantly swept the seas and harassed the Spaniards at their pleasure. Every day, the Dutch grew richer and more powerful. In Holland, the adventurous spirit received a strong stimulus from the blind and stupid policy of the Spanish king. For 100 years, ever since the discovery of the Cape route to the East Indies, Lisbon had been the great centre of the Eastern trade. The Dutch traders came to bring wheat, fish, and other products of Northern Europe, and to carry away in return the spices and merchandise of the East. In 1594, Philip, who had some time before acquired the crown of Portugal, closed the port of Lisbon and prohibited Dutch and English ships, even under a neutral flag, from trading with any part of his empire. The blow not only failed of its effect, but recoiled on the striker. It ruined Lisbon, crippled Spain, and made the Dutch East Indian Empire. With a sagacious daring, the Hollanders immediately formed the steady resolve to find these eastern treasures for themselves and wrest the trade from their enemies. Okay, end quote. So basically, the Dutch were being persecuted, and on the land, they had no means of resisting this persecution. They didn't have an army that could compete with Spain, but because many Dutchmen were fishermen and traders, they had boats. This meant they could resist persecution by taking to the seas, and that's exactly what they did. They began roaming the oceans, making a living from piracy and illicit trade. They raided Spanish colonies in the Americas. They robbed Spanish and Portuguese ships carrying silk, spice, and gold from the New World. And most importantly for our purposes, they decided to cut out the Spanish and Portuguese middlemen by sailing to the east. They would no longer buy their merchandise from Lisbon. What the Portuguese had done to the Muslims, the Dutch would do to the Portuguese. The first couple of attempts that the Dutch made to reach the East Indies ended in total failure. In the 16th century, there was a popular theory that you could reach the east by sailing around the north of Europe. The Dutch decided to test this theory. They would sail north and take the Portuguese forces in the East Indies by surprise. These expeditions proved disastrous. The Dutch ships encountered harsh Arctic conditions, treacherous icebergs, and fierce storms. Many sailors perished during these early attempts, and the theory of reaching the East Indies by sailing around the north of Europe was discredited. After accepting the fact that they could not find a passage through the frozen seas of the north, the Dutch decided that they would follow in the footsteps of the Portuguese. Through industrial espionage, they gained access to confidential Portuguese maps and learned their business practices. They found out that the Portuguese sailed away from Europe down the west coast of Africa. They would then round the southern tip of Africa and sail up the east coast of that continent. They would then cross the Indian Ocean and arrive in India. From India, they would sail to the East Indies. With this information secured, the Dutch began making their own way to Indonesia. In 1594, a group of merchants from Antwerp and Amsterdam established a new company called the Company of Far Lands. The next year, the Company of Far Lands sent 250 men to Java. These men were spread across 4 ships. When they finally arrived in Java, they were almost immediately attacked by both the indigenous population and the Portuguese merchants who had previously claimed the land. The Dutch fled the scene in search of a safer place to stay, but almost everywhere they docked, they were greeted with conflict. After 3 years of constant conflict in Java, sometimes with the natives, sometimes with the Portuguese, only 89 Dutch men made their way back to Holland. Less than half the crew had returned, and they only had a single cargo of pepper, and little to no other spices or valuable goods. Nevertheless, even with the seemingly unimpressive haul, the merchants of Antwerp and Amsterdam still made a good profit on the expedition. This excited other wealthy Dutch merchants who saw a fresh opportunity to make money. Multiple companies sprang up and began scrambling for a share of the Indonesian spice trade. By 1599, 6 new companies from places like Rotterdam and Zeeland were established. They were all motivated by the same thing. They wanted to acquire spices from the east to sell in the north. By the end of the 16th century, the Dutch were sending huge fleets to the east in search of pepper and other rare spices. Typically, half the men who made their way to the east died, either on the voyage or in battle against the natives or Portuguese. In 1601, the 6 Dutch companies sent 65 ships to the Spice Islands. All of these ships wanted to bring home spice. The increased demand led to an increase in price. Muslim merchants in Indonesia began asking for exorbitant amounts of money, which they got. The Netherlands was then flooded with spice. Merchants in Amsterdam were forced to lower their prices to compete with one another. Profits quickly began to dwindle. Intense competition among the Dutch companies was making the spice trade unprofitable. In 1602, the Dutch government decided to intervene. It merged the 6 rival companies into a single entity. This mega merger of a corporation became known as the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company was not merely a commercial body. Commerce and profit was the chief object of the company. But in order to make the voyages profitable, the company was invested with political power. Indeed, the company had the same sort of power that a sovereign ruler had. It had its own civil and criminal tribunals. It could execute and imprison people found guilty of committing a crime. It was authorized to proclaim martial law. It could establish colonies. It could send its own ambassadors to the native governments and conclude treaties with them. It could, within its own realm, declare war and peace. It produced its own form of currency. They minted their own coins, stamped with the company's logo in gold, silver, and bronze. They even had their own private army. But it was still a company concerned with profit and trade. So, the CEO of the Dutch East India Company was, in some ways, comparable to a king. He had the same sort of power that a European monarch had. But unlike a European monarch, he didn't rule by virtue of his bloodline. He did not have a God-given right to rule. He was accountable to a board of directors and to shareholders. If he started to make poor decisions that resulted in loss of profit, he could expect to be removed from his position. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment to talk about Moldbug, because this will all sound very familiar to anyone who has read him. Moldbug is, of course, a monarchist. He believes that one person should be responsible for making political decisions, which is what monarchy is. Mono means one, archy means rule. Monarchy is simply rule by one. It doesn't necessarily mean rule by a hereditary monarch who holds their position by virtue of their bloodline. It could also mean rule by a CEO. And that's of course what Moldbug promotes. He wants a world of thousands of city-states which are ruled not by hereditary kings, but by for-profit sovereign corporations. Now, the only reason I mention this is because that's sort of what the Dutch East India Company was. It was a for-profit sovereign corporation. It wasn't totally sovereign, but you get my point. It's probably one of the closest things we've ever had to a sovereign corporation. Okay, what was it like to work for the Dutch East India Company? It appears to have been incredibly brutal. Many men of the company perished in its service. It was not uncommon for a quarter of the crew to die on any given expedition. And those who were lucky enough to make it to the East Indies often died from diseases that they contracted in the East. For this reason, most men avoided joining the Dutch East India Company if they could. This meant that the Dutch East India Company often had to employ vagabonds, criminals, and the unfortunate from throughout Europe. These men had to be dealt with firmly. Anyone who threatened someone with a knife in anger on a Dutch East India ship was nailed to the mast with a knife through his hand. The only way he could leave this position was by pulling the knife from his own hand. This was done for simply threatening violence. If you actually injured someone on board the ship, you were dealt with even more severely. Any sailor who injured another on board a Dutch East India ship was tied to a rope and then thrown overboard. They would then be dragged under the ship's keel, often resulting in death. They were ferocious too in their attitude towards their rivals in the spice trade. One of the most infamous examples of Dutch ferocity is the way they treated the English in the East Indies. On one occasion, they captured an English military base in the East Indies and tortured the men by stretching them on the rack, waterboarding them, and slowly burning them alive. They were equally ferocious in their behaviour to the Catholics. They burned houses and churches and would destroy Catholic iconography. The Chinese called the Dutch red-haired barbarians, and that seems like a pretty fair description. Shortly after its establishment, the company set itself the task of colonizing Indonesia. Indonesia at this time was not a unified country, but a hodgepodge of different peoples and nations, which it pretty much still is, but anyway. One of the peoples that occupied the Indonesian archipelago were the Portuguese. As discussed in episode 2, Portugal had tried to monopolize Southeast Asian trade. They had successfully gotten rich selling spices to Europe, but they had never been able to completely monopolize Southeast Asian trade. The Muslims remained a powerful force in places like Malaysia and Indonesia. The Portuguese controlled Malacca, but they did not control the trade that centered around it. And at the start of the 17th century, they were beginning to experience some serious issues. They were short on both money and manpower. Their organization was inefficient and corrupt. Even the Portuguese governors of Malacca violated the monopoly they were supposed to maintain by buying contraband from the Muslims. They were also struggling to maintain their technological and military supremacy over the region. Their rivals in the region had learned how to make their weapons, and they were quickly learning their military techniques. The Dutch East India Company brought better organization, better guns, better ships, better financial backing, and the same combination of courage and brutality. Like the Portuguese, they wanted exclusive access to the spices of Indonesia. In order to gain that exclusive access, they would have to destroy the Portuguese presence in the East Indies. When they arrived in Indonesia, they formed an anti-Portuguese alliance with the Muslims. Now, this brings us to one of the key differences between the Dutch and the Portuguese. The Dutch were a lot more tolerant of the Muslims. The Dutch East India Company would happily enter into alliances with the infidel, something that would have been unthinkable to the Portuguese. They were more concerned with making money than proselytizing or spreading the faith. When the Protestant chaplains arrived in the East, they reminded the Dutch Governor-General that they were forbidden by the law of Moses to tolerate non-Christian religions. The Governor-General replied by saying that the law of the old Jewish republics didn't apply in the territory controlled by the Dutch East India Company. And so, the men of the Dutch East India Company not only tolerated Muslims, but happily entered into alliances with them. In return for helping the Muslims remove the Portuguese, the Dutch were given the sole right to purchase spices. The Dutch, alongside the Muslims, slowly drove the Portuguese from the East Indies. The Catholic missionaries were expelled from those islands, and local Catholics were converted to Calvinism. The Dutch had established forts and trading posts throughout the East Indies, but they wanted to establish a proper colony there, not just a fort or trading post. They were convinced that anyone who wanted to monopolize trade in the region needed to become a land-based colonial power in Java. The company decided to establish a headquarters in Java. More precisely, they decided to establish a headquarters in Jakarta, which is the capital of modern-day Indonesia. At this time, Jakarta was a Muslim city. In 1619, the Dutch East India Company stormed Jakarta, reduced it to ashes, and drove the Muslim forces out. Standing amidst the ashes of Jakarta, the Dutch decided to rename this town Batavia. The Batavians were a Germanic tribe that lived in the area that is now the Netherlands. The ancient Romans used to refer to the Netherlands as Batavia. In the newly named Batavia, the Dutch East India headquarters were constructed. They built a large castle. Walls were built around the coastal edge of the castle to defend the fortress from naval attacks. A collection of hired soldiers from various countries, including Germany, Scotland, Belgium, and Japan, patrolled the castle around the clock. This castle became the headquarters of the Dutch East India Company's vast trading empire. The conquest of Batavia was the most significant step taken by the Dutch since their first ship set sail for the East. Batavia became the military and administrative center of the Dutch Empire. It was a relatively safe site for the warehousing and exchanging of goods because no major Muslim or European power was close enough to threaten it. To make room for more Dutch plantations, the Javanese were banished from Batavia. Almost all of the natives were either expelled, killed, or wasted away from starvation. They were replaced by people from the Netherlands who sailed to Batavia in droves. A community soon flourished within and around the fortress. Batavia grew into a large city, prosperous and strong. The Dutch became the greatest power in the Eastern world. They dominated an island that was large, fertile, and populous. Batavia became the center of a huge maritime empire which extended from Madagascar to Japan, from New Guinea to the Red Sea. Now that we have discussed the establishment of the Dutch Empire, it is time to talk about the topic at hand. The Dutch merchants had read the works of the Spanish, and they were convinced that there was a huge continent rich in gold and spices in the South Pacific. Almost immediately after establishing themselves in the East Indies, the Dutch began making plans to explore the Great South Land. They hoped to find the mythical continent that was thought to be larger than Europe and rich in gold, silver, and spices.